My name is Earl Cameron. I'm the Executive Vice President of the auto-funded SGI in Saskatchewan, and I'm also Saskatchewan rep on the CCMTA board. I'll be your moderator for today, and the following presentation will last about an hour, and then we'll conclude with questions at the end. We have a mic that we can use at the end. The name of the presentation, I'm not going to read that out. We have it there. And to discuss this topic, we have Dr. Goledzinowski, very good, yeah, Senior Research Scientist with ACS Corporation. The doctor holds a PhD in chemistry, and prior to joining ACS was a research scientist working on the development of chemical trace detectors at the Smiths Detections in Mississauga. In order to achieve the best detectability of explosives and narcotics, he has developed chemical formulations for verification and calibration of these tests and optimized control and operational parameters. He continues to be a professional chemist, a senior research scientist at ACS for developing the next generation of advanced alcohol fuel cell sensors. The doctor's expertise is directly involved in this proposal, including material in science, sensors, and electrochemistry, engineering, R&D, and analytical chemistry. A lot of big words here. So we're going to ask him to come up and speak, and then we'll have some questions after, and this is going to be really good. So thank you very much, Doctor, for coming.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. First of all, I'd like to thank CCMTA for a kind invitation and opportunity to present and share with you challenges related to a current very hot subject, which is marijuana and driving. Please note that the content of this presentation shows the results based on pure science and experimental investigation, and no other agenda will be included here. So this presentation will be divided for a few parts. First, marijuana, chemistry and composition, cannabinoids, pharmacokinetics, including absorption, metabolism, and extraction, elimination, route of administration. Second subject, driving impairment, correlation between THC and metabolites, metabolite content and driving impairment, then technologies for roadside drug detection, and legislative approaches for dealing with drug-impaired driving. The third one, roadside screening, particularly screening versus evidential analysis. And the subject number 4, legal challenges in driving under drug influence, prosecution and possible solutions. And at the end, recommendations and conclusions. First, marijuana, chemistry and composition, pharmacokinetics, route of administration. What is pharmacokinetics? It's a chemical metabolism from administration to complete elimination, including absorption, distribution, and elimination. Marijuana is a term for a drug which is obtained from dried flowers and leaves of cannabis plant. Cannabis is a botanical term. Marijuana is a drug. Sometimes it's used interchangeably. Marijuana contains over 400 different chemical compounds, including around 60 belonging to the chemical group of cannabinoids with psychoactive properties. Some of them, they have no psychoactive properties. Cannabinoids primarily are concentrated in flowers, in cannabis flowers, and are less concentrated in leaves and stems. Amount and mixtures of cannabinoids vary with species of the plant, growing practices, timing of the harvest, climate, and so on. so on. Most psychoactive component of marijuana is THC, delta-9 tetrahydrocannabinol, and this is the upper part of the slide shows the process of how we obtain marijuana. So the first compound on the left-hand side is a so-called THC acid, which is part of the living plant. It's not psychoactive. Then, due to the process of decarboxylation, we receive highly psychoactive THC plus cannabinol, which is slightly psychoactive, and CBD, cannabidiol, which is non-psychoactive. Now, the next part of chemistry, it's a metabolism. Don't be scared of those formulations. On the bottom of this page is just a summary. So THC is highly psychoactive. In the first phase, metabolic process, it converts to 11-hydroxy-THC and 11-carboxy-THC. 11-hydroxy-THC is psychoactive, and carboxy-THC is a metabolic product which is not psychoactive at all. And during the phase 2 metabolism, the THC is converted into the THC carboxylic acid glucuronide, which is usually eliminated in urine. So THC again, psychoactive, hydroxy-THC, metabolic psychoactive product, carboxy-THC, non-psychoactive, and THC carboxylic acid glucuronide. Marijuana, psychoactive symptoms and route of administration. So we have a physical and psychophysical action. Physical, it caused pronounced body sway, eyelid and body tremors, which means uncontrolled muscle movement, slow deliberate speech, dilated pupils, widening pupils, watery red eyes, sometimes increased blood pressure, particularly for new users, increased pulse rate. Some psychophysical symptoms include relaxed inhibitions, sharpened sense of humor, difficulty with concentration, disorientation, short-term memory problems, fatigue, lethargic, altered time and space perception, which is probably most important effect for driving. What is important at the bottom of the page, of the slide? THC level in blood or saliva is not indicative what is in the brain. This is very important. How we administrate marijuana? There are 3 different ways. First, smoking, most popular, vaping, which means vapor inhalation, and ingestion as edibles. Most efficient drug delivery is by smoking or vaping, affects central nervous system within seconds. Now, pharmacokinetics of THC. This is smoking, THC content in the blood as a function of time. So we see very sharp increase in concentration within few minutes after smoking or during smoking. And there's a very fast decay in the concentration, in blood concentration. Another observation, which is important, the metabolic product, hydroxy-THC, it's in much lower level than THC itself. It's about up to 20 times lower than THC. The final metabolic product, which is non-active carboxy THC, it stays in the blood for many hours, sometimes days. So it's not the indication for the recent use. The previous use, yes, but not the recent use. Now we are very interested how blood concentration of THC is related to saliva concentration. In controlled laboratory conditions, this is very important, controlled laboratory conditions, we observe THC concentrations versus time goes very parallel, except very first, let's say half an hour. There is a spike in oral fluid concentration of THC due to contamination in the mouth. So there is a good correlation, basically, between THC content in blood and oral fluid. But again, in clinical controlled setting. And again, this spike at the very beginning in oral fluid is caused by contamination in the oral cavity. The concentration of carboxy THC inactive metabolic product is very low in saliva. It's almost not measurable. Now the same investigation, THC in blood versus saliva in roadside test. You see the scatter of on the curve. So this high variability in THC ratio between oral fluid and blood in real roadside setting is caused by the following unknown dosage, time frame between consumption and sampling, oral contamination after smoking, THC removal by eating, drinking, saliva swallowing. So this is not the actual roadside test. We cannot control all the parameters, all the factors. And basically, there are some physiological causes for variability of THC in oral fluid and blood. It's a saliva pH, acidity, drug molecular weight. It's not only THC, but other drugs as well. Drug acidity, lipid solubility, saliva flow rate, elimination kinetics. Now we go to edibles. We know in the recent years, the oral administration of cannabis or marijuana becomes very popular for recreational purposes. So we have cookies, brownies, gummies, cakes, candies, chocolate bars, and another product, high-potency extract-based concentrates like oils, waxes, shatter, which contains very high percentage of THC, 80 to 90%. They usually, when used in the wrong way, they lead to over-intoxication. The third is a liquid. It's a marijuana in the form of liquid, which can be obtained from hemp milk by extraction of THC from hemp plant. To the group of edibles, we need to count also medical products. They use as a medical, they call it medical marijuana. So we have several formulations of synthetic THC like Marinol, Syndros, Sesamet, which contains synthetic THC. Sativex, it's a popular formulation. It's obtained from plant. It contains 50% THC and 50% CBD, and is used as a sublingual spray. Epidiolex It's a plant-derived CBD, which is non-psychoactive, and now it's in the clinical trial phase for pediatric epilepsy. Now, very interesting, the difference between pharmacokinetics of cannabinoids smoked versus edibles. This is very important as well. For comparison, on the right-hand side, I put again this elimination, the concentration of THC while smoked. Very fast increase in the blood and then very quick decay. The upper graph on the left-hand side shows THC in edibles. What we see here, the concentration, the maximum concentration of THC in edibles, when it comes to the blood, it's much lower than as compared to smoked. Same, again, another factor is the timing. For smoked, we have a peak concentration within minutes. For THC as edible, we have a peak concentration within about 1 hour, which is very different. And sometimes leads to over intoxication because people taking brownie or some other edible and they wait for some time and nothing is happening. So they take another one. And after 1 hour, they are suddenly they're over intoxicated. Another major difference between smoked and edible marijuana is a concentration of hydroxy THC. Hydroxy THC is in much lower concentration in the blood when smoked. On the right-hand side. The bottom graph on left-hand side, you see hydroxy THC, which is a psychoactive compound. It's have a comparable or higher concentration than THC. So this is a major difference between smoked and edibles. Now, same ingested marijuana versus smoked in saliva. This graph shows administration of 25 milligrams of ingested THC and smoked THC. Again, ingested THC shows about 10 times lower concentration in saliva than after smoking with the same amount. And also the time frame. Please look at the time. For smoked, it's again within the maximum in saliva is achieved within, let's say, 10 minutes, 15 minutes. For ingested, it takes about 1.5 hours to go to the high concentration. Now, next subject, driving impairment. Correlation between THC and metabolite content and driving impairment. We know this for alcohol. We try to establish this for drugs, for THC. Then a quick look at the technologies for roadside drug detection and legislative approaches for dealing with drug impaired driving. Very important question. Correlation between THC content in the blood, in the system, in the human system, and driving impairment. Alcohol impairment, we know there is a good correlation between blood alcohol concentration, BAC, and impairment. BAC can be back extrapolated. It's a simple metabolism. THC impairment, there is no simple and direct correlation between THC concentration in blood and impairment. This is a very important statement based on science. And this lack of correlation between THC concentration and impairment is due to, first, THC, as opposed to alcohol, is soluble in lipids, in fats, and then it stays in the fat. It's retention. We have a very different individual metabolic profiles. Also, administration frequency, chronic versus casual users. They react different way for THC drug. Also driving experience, health, age, other physiological factors. As opposed to alcohol, THC concentration cannot be back extrapolated due to unknown intake time, method of administration, inter-subject variability in metabolic rate. If you remember the very fast peak in concentration in the blood within minutes, so we cannot back extrapolate. We don't know when this person took a drug. There were several attempts to correlate between THC content in the blood and driving impairment. Basically, the effect of cannabis on driving is following. It's a decision-making problems, divided attention, visual search, focus, concentration, reaction time, road tracking, vehicle control. One of the major and popular measure or metrics of impairment is standard deviation from lateral position while driving. It was done for alcohol, it was done for marijuana, for THC. This graph represents standard deviation from lateral position as a function of concentration of alcohol, the upper axis, and THC. And BAC, the identical SDLP deviation for BAC alcohol equal 50 is equivalent to about 8 nanogram per milliliter of blood of THC. For BAC 80, it's equivalent, the same SDLP deviation is equal to about 13 milligram per nanogram per milliliter of THC. This is a mistake. It's a nanogram, not milligram. Now, how we investigate the drug and on the effect of drugs on driving performance. So first, we have epidemiological studies. What is the drug incidence in fatal or non-fatal accidents? Causal drug effects, culpability and responsibility analysis. Second, performance or experimental impairment studies, effect of drugs on cognitive and or psychomotor tasks. And the third approach is a driving simulator and open road driving studies, effects on drugs in situations closely resembling the real driving. What is the correlation? Again, correlation between THC content and driving impairment. Summarizing experimental and epidemiological studies shows that statistical association between traffic crashes and risk factor after drug consumption we can express as an odds ratio, OR. OR equal 1 is a control group. OR larger than 1 means increased accident risk. And from this experimental studies, many researchers found that blood THC concentration in the range of 6 to 8 nanogram per mil is equivalent to odds ratio between 1.5 to 2, which is again equivalent to blood alcohol around 50. What is the flaw in the studies? Most of the studies investigate association between oral crash and traces of cannabinoids instead of crash risk versus acute intoxication. So this is a flaw. We need to investigate crash risk versus intoxication, not the drug content. Usually impairment is expected to rise with dose, but it's also dependent on tolerance, driving experience, and baseline THC level for chronic users. They have a THC in particularly everyday users, they have a permanently THC in their blood at the level of between, let's say, 2 to 5 to 7 nanogram per mil. And they are not necessarily intoxicated or impaired. This is the lower graph. On the right-hand side is a similar approach, which was done probably in 60s in Michigan, Grand Rapids study for alcohol. They investigated the crash, the accidents, car accidents on a certain road section at certain time of the day, and at certain weather conditions to eliminate other factors. So they found that above BAC, blood alcohol concentration around 80, there was an exponential growth in accidents, in fatal or non-fatal accidents. Again, as a summary, correlation between Thc content and driving impairment. The fundamental challenge, there is the THC presence versus impairment. There's no correlation. Establishing per se THC limit, similarly as for alcohol, and proof of impairment has no scientific value or scientific basis. The third point, delays between roadside screening tests and confirmatory blood testing might miss the impaired drivers due to fast THC decay below the cutoff level, particularly for casual users. Usually the blood test is performed at least 1 hour after stop check. So we need, police needs to take the person to the hospital, to the medical facility to draw the blood. And at that time, might be nothing in the system, or close to nothing. Habitual users have an elevated THC level, as I mentioned, and likely above typical per se levels, and being charged even though they are not impaired. So what we need is a science-based performance and driving ability measures. Roadside screening, next subject. Currently, we are using, we measure for THC screening on the roadside, classical lateral flow immunoassay system. Saliva is collected from the mouth of the person and is extracted with buffer solution and deposited on the cellulose test strip containing antibodies. Sample is moving by capillary action to colorimetric marker conjugated with antibodies. And the color change is measured visually or colorimetrically. What is the advantage of this methodology? It's fast, non-invasive, and we can perform multiple sampling. It's a good indication of the recent use, up to 2 to 4 hours. And as we mentioned before, it's a good correlation of THC concentration with blood concentration. What we have now, recent devices for roadside saliva screening. The drug wipe Securitex. This the products are much improved over the last years, and we can, they achieve the ability 95 to 97% in sensitivity, specificity, and accuracy. The detection limit is 5 nanogram per mil for THC, and 5 minutes testing time for THC, which is acceptable. Marijuana in breath. There's a lot of noise, I would say, or press releases about progress in marijuana tested in breath. What is the principle? Breath contains bioaerosol of drug microparticles measurable by GCMS methodology in picogram level, very low level. This is a separate science known in medical community to detect diseases from breath by measuring the biomarkers, chemical biomarkers released by the breath, exhaled by the breath. The leading group is in Sweden, I believe. But again, we can measure every single drug, medicinal drug or illegal drug, in breath, but it's in picogram level. It's measured, this measurement is only possible in the lab due to GCMS, by GCMS methodology. And drugs can be inhaled or administered orally. We still see the drug in the bioaerosol in the very low level. Several groups are working on marijuana breathalyzer for drug screening purpose, but the results so far are not very conclusive or not available. Detection principle is ion mobility spectrometry, fluorimetry, or polymer resistive sensors. The first one is most reliable. This technology, ion mobility spectrometry, is used for detection of traces of drugs and explosives at the airports. It can measure the drugs in the picogram level. But this is, for now, the development doesn't show this is, from the financial point of view, it's feasible. It's the machine costs about a few $1,000s at least. So it's not for every, for the roadside detection. And again, marijuana in breath, most of the particles comes from the airwaves. So it's designed, the marijuana in breath is designed for only very recent marijuana use, if it's working. So limitation of this approach is low detection limit and potentially low specificity. Now, the next subject, legal challenges in driving under drug influence for prosecution and possible solutions. Regulatory options might vary dramatically in various countries. First, we have 4 systems. Zero tolerance. Driver is prosecuted for a minimum detectable level of drug or metabolite in the body fluids. Doesn't matter if it's impaired or not. Zero tolerance. Per se limit. Driver is prosecuted for having a level of drug at or above a preset limit in the body fluids. For example, 5 nanograms per mil THC in most of the legislations. No impairment needs to be shown, which is disturbing. You have over 5 milligram per mil, or nanogram, sorry, again, this is a mistake. It's 5 nanogram THC, and you are charged. Hybrid system, driver is prosecuted if there is a measurable signs of impairment and minimum detectable level of drug in the body fluids. two-tier penalty system. Driver is prosecuted with lower non-criminal offense if there is a minimum detectable level of drug in the body fluids. So it's a ticket. It's a non-criminal offense. Or is prosecuted with an impaired driving offense if there is a measurable signs of impairment. Now, next slide. It's a brief summary of all those approaches. Zero tolerance usually is present in countries or states where possession of marijuana is illegal. It's a prohibitionist approach. This option is not workable in view of global trend of cannabis decriminalization and legalization. Incrimination of drivers whose body fluid contains any amount of drug or metabolite and not being impaired, for example, chronic users. Also, there is a risk of conviction drivers with heavy passive exposure to marijuana smoke in closed area, for example, car cabin. There are several papers showing THC content in the blood of the person who did not smoke but was close to the smoker. Per se limits is promoted by strong advocacy groups in developed countries who are willing to provide law enforcement with a number in exchange for legalization and treating cannabis like alcohol, which was supported by voters in Montana, Pennsylvania, Washington, Colorado. Typical per se limit of THC in blood varies between 1 and 5 nanogram per mil, depending on the country or state. There is no scientific evidence of relationship between THC concentration in blood and degree of impairment as for alcohol, or there is no scientifically proven connection between THC psychoactive effect and its level in the bodily fluids. That's what we discussed earlier. Hybrid system is likely suitable for legislations with decriminalized marijuana possession or use. Two-tier penalty system likely suitable for legislation with legal access to recreational and or medical marijuana. Based on complex THC metabolism, including drug tolerance and individual metabolic profiles, criminal charges should be imposed on drivers who are measurably impaired but not having certain level of drug in the body fluids. This is very important. We need to prove impairment. Continuing, law enforcement general facts. Prosecution of driving under drug offense requires clear evidence of driver impairment. This is a very important, and we need to understand. We need to prove that the person is impaired, regardless how much of drug is in his system. There is a poor understanding of substance use versus driving under influence and impairment. Training law enforcement officers on the signs and symptoms of impairment and reinforce existing training for drug-impaired drivers for nearly every police officer, not only drug recognition experts. Roadside saliva tests combined with testimony of arresting officer might not be sufficient for prosecution. Evidential chemical blood test is flagged with significant delay between roadside check and sample collection. This is how it's now in Canada. First of all, there is no THC detection due to fast metabolism, particularly occasional users. The THC level dissipates from the blood very quickly. Also, there is no THC detection, even by roadside screening, while still impaired by the THC presence in brain, particularly for first-time users, teenagers who might have several puffs. Their THC level in blood might be very low, not measurable, but the brain is affected. They are impaired. Roadside drug screening versus evidential analysis. What we do on the roadside? What are the steps? First, we observe driving behavior, like speeding, unable to maintain lane position, run red lights or stop signs, unsafe lane change, going too slow, or collision. This is obvious initial observation. We don't need to discuss it. Physical indicators, green tongue, dilated pupils, red eyes, again, obvious initial observation. Then, step number 3, standard field sobriety test. 2 to 5 cues. It includes, for example, one leg stand, walk and turn, HGN, which is horizontal nystagmus. Yeah, eye observation. There are several works done which of the cues are more relevant for drug impairment. And it looks like this the one leg stand, walk and turn, and horizontal gaze nystagmus is the most sensitive for drug impairment detection. Step number 4, drug screening by existing oral fluid drug screening devices. And then the last step is a confirmation and evidential analysis by collection of body fluids, blood, saliva, or urine, for laboratory analysis for prosecution. Roadside drug screening versus evidential analysis. So this is step number 4. Again, we have a good correlation in the concentration of THC in oral fluid in blood. Positive test for screening is a strong indication of marijuana use over the last couple of hours. State-of-art drug screening devices based on classical immunoassay are capable to detect THC with high sensitivity and accuracy and specificity in 5 minutes at low detection limit of 5 nanogram per mil. Methodology is successfully adopted in Australia, Europe, Scandinavia, and United Kingdom for mandatory roadside drugs and alcohol screening, just roadside check. And it has pretty high deterrence effect in view of growing worldwide trend of marijuana legalization. Now, step number 5, confirmatory evidential analysis. Confirmatory test is always required in case of failed standard field sobriety test and or oral fluid screening test. Blood test is significantly delayed up to 1 to 2 hours since sampling is performed in medical facility. This graph shows how it works. So there is a smoking, the person is driving, you see how THC goes down with time. Then there's arrest, and after 1 hour it's a test. It's almost nothing there. So that's why we need, for evidential purposes, to have bodily fluid sample taken at the time of arrest or stop check. And since the blood test is usually delayed, the oral fluid test for evidential purpose collected at the time of roadside check is a fast and convenient methodology for potential prosecution. So we need, instead of taking blood after 1 or 2 hours, we take a second sample of saliva for evidential purposes. The challenges related to this approach is a sample storage and transportation, and sufficient number of certified and qualified laboratories. Recommendations. Main goal. We need to present evidence of impairment regardless of the results of roadside drug screening test. There is no device who can measure drug impairment at the roadside. We need to measure the impairment. The challenges related to current approaches. First, chronic users, including medical marijuana users, they are chronic users, might have a residual but measurable THC content in the body without showing obvious signs of impairment. Secondly, occasional or first-time users, usually adolescents, might show impairment with little dose, not measurable but roadside screening devices. Bias related to evidential blood analysis due to delay in sample collection, this is the current procedure. And this is a challenge. In view of lack scientifically proven correlation between THC level and impairment, the most reliable and efficient approach for identifying THC impaired drivers is first, oral fluid screening test, secondly, scores on standard field sobriety test, and the third, confirmatory test if number 1 or number 2 fails. So we need a confirmatory test. It's evidential test by collecting secondary oral fluid sample at the time of stop check, followed by laboratory analysis. Proposed legal code in Canada in view of cannabis legalization. Because of the cannabis, of marijuana will be legal for recreational purpose. The most reliable approach is a 2-tier penalty, which means the driver is prosecuted with lower non-criminal offense if there is a minimum detectable level of drug in the body fluids, or driver is prosecuted with an impairment driving offense if there is a measurable signs of impairment. If prosecuted, some penalties as driving under influence of alcohol, including administrative and criminal suspensions. What we proposed is a zero tolerance policy for THC for young drivers under the age of 21. What is important? No legal THC limit is recommended because there is no scientific basis for that, similarly as for alcohol. Now, the second point, growing problem of polydrug use, including alcohol and prescription medication, like stimulants, antidepressants, benzodiazepines. People are taking few drugs simultaneously. So again, we need to prove impairment instead of drug present. Even if we find several drugs in the body, we need to prove the impairment. Now, we need to distinguish policies on medical marijuana from social policies related to decriminalization and legalization of recreational marijuana. What we need is to train police officers to identify drug impairment using standard field sobriety test. Drug recognition experts are excellent, but not required. Every police officer should be trained to perform the standard field sobriety test. Also, what we need is aggressive public awareness campaign with strong message. Drugs impair driving skills, and regardless of the legal status of the drug and purpose of the drug use, medical versus recreational. So someone might say, the doctor prescribed me THC or marijuana to ease my pain. So what does it mean? Can I drive? No. THC does not know if it's medical or recreational. It's the same action, psychoactive action. Conclusions. This is a summary of this presentation. Marijuana metabolism is different from alcohol. It's very different. Smoking versus edibles, different metabolism and detectability window. There is no correlation between THC content in the body and impairment. Very important statement. There is no scientific basis for per se THC limit in blood or saliva. Hybrid or two-tier penalty system is suitable for countries with decriminalized, legalized marijuana use. Current roadside screening device is a good indication of recent cannabis use. It's just indication. Screening. Delay in evidential blood sampling has a little value due to fast THC metabolism. With current approach to draw the blood in the medical facility with the delay. So the most efficient methodology to identify and find or prosecute the drug impaired drivers, it's first drug screening test, oral fluid, standard field sobriety test by police officer, and evidential saliva or blood collection at the time of stop check. In some states, the police officers are trained to draw the blood at the spot. And very final conclusion. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen, for your attention.
Thank you. Just stay for some questions.
Stay?
Yeah.
Stay.
We have some questions now. That was a little bit worrisome what you've told us.
Really?
Yeah.
This is
A
science.
bit concerning.
Science.
It's science. It's science. Well, I knew I shouldn't have skipped out of those chemistry class right at the start. I was worried. But all serious side, is there some questions for Doctor? And here we go. Cindy, get a couple.
In your recommendations, you are saying there should be no per se level set. So my question for you would be Transport Canada, or not Transport Canada, but the federal Liberals, when they announced the legalization policy, have already indicated they're going to have per se levels in there. So what is your comment on that?
My comment might be scientific. It's not. It has no scientific basis there's no scientific basis for per se limit for marijuana, period. Of course, legislators love to have a number. They like to have a number. So you have a 5 nanogram per mil, you are charged. It doesn't matter if you are impaired or not, but the science said this person might be not impaired because he's a chronic user. They might have a smoke a week ago or even a month ago. There is some research done with chronic users who quit smoking for several weeks, and they still have a elevated level of THC in the blood up to a month.
Okay. We have a question over here too, I think. He's lost his hand.
There are some regulators in the U.S. who are contemplating using hair testing in truck drivers for their random drug and alcohol tests. Is that an effective way of proving impairment on the spot, or does that again show the long-term use?
It's a long-term use for chronic users. In hair, there's accumulation over the period of time.
Good, lots of questions.
Okay, go ahead. Yeah.
No, that's good.
I'll try to answer.
The risk chart you put up measuring the odds ratio for.
Pardon me?
you put up a chart against that of the Grand Rapids chart in your presentation.
Which chart?
There's a chart on the risk.
On the risk one?
The odds ratio versus the THC in the blood.
I think I know what you mean. This
Yes. Between the top one, between 0 and 4, it looks like the odds ratio is less than 1. Is there any explanation for that? The odds ratio. Yeah, between 0 and 4, it's less than 1. Is there any?
I think I know what you're talking about. There are some reports or individual impressions or statements that after marijuana, they're driving better.
There are certain factors which determine that THC levels don't necessarily correlate with degree of impairment, such as tolerance, such as prior driving experience and skills. Why does this not apply to alcohol as well?
Dr. Matt. They'll never hear you, yeah.
What is tolerance? It's a reinforced learning. So people who are driving, for example, the same distance on the road, the same road for years, and they're having alcohol, they're drinking alcohol, they might have a tolerance. So they know what to expect, regardless of the impairment. If they go to another task, another road, another weather conditions, they might not be doing very well. There are people, we know that, they're driving for years, impaired, for 20 years, for 30 years. They were never caught. They're still driving. They have a tolerance, which is a reinforced learning again. The same might apply to marijuana.
I agree with everything you're saying, but still we have a hard cutoff for alcohol, but not for THC.
Could you repeat the question? What was your original question?
Well, the original question was because of factors such as tolerance and prior driving experience,
Yeah.
THC levels don't necessarily correlate with degree of impairment.
Yeah.
And why do not these same considerations apply to alcohol?
THC is present when impairment effect of THC is what you have in the brain, not necessarily in the blood. I know the research was done several years ago with post-mortem analysis, people who died in the traffic accident. They were investigated. The investigators analyzed the THC content in blood and in brain. There were cases where there is almost no THC in the blood, but tons of THC in the brain, and opposite. So this is everything. Everything depends on the metabolic profile of the person also.
Okay. Do we have another one?
Great. My question is, because there's basically 3 primary types of cannabis, being sativa, indica, and hybrids.
Yeah.
Is there any research to show if a sativa, which is supposed to give you energy, versus an indica, which makes you into more like a couch potato, if there's a difference between those?
No, there's a following problem. Marijuana is still Schedule 1 drug in US. It's illegal on the federal level. There are almost no in the climate of illegality of the drug. There were no research done how the marijuana works for human body from the point of view of bad things, which affects the brain negatively, and the positive things for medical purposes. There's not much research because there were simple problem to receive legally the product. I think it's only one facility in States which is licensed to produce marijuana for several years already for research purposes. This is everything the future. We need to investigate. We don't know, we know many bad things, negative things about marijuana. We don't know about the positive things, like CBD, certain components of marijuana. They have a, let's say, proven or almost proven properties for clinical purposes, like epilepsy, AIDS treatment, appetite losing, those things. We need really have a program, wide program to investigate those things. In the climate of the drug was not legal, it was not possible to legally to perform such a extensive investigation. Everything is ahead of us. It's a beginning.
Okay, any more questions? Nope. Jerry?
Doctor, I have two questions. One is that you indicate that the DRE is not required. Recognizing that the new legislation is impaired by drugs, it's not just impaired by THC. If the oral fluid devices, which have a palette of 6 to 8 drugs, and you hit a drug that's not in there, you're still going to need a DRE to make that evaluation. Yeah. So by you saying they're not required is somewhat, I wouldn't agree with that recommendation. And secondly, if you think that in the middle of the night at the roadside, that a police officer is going to start drawing blood or taking a saliva sample from someone, that's a very unrealistic recommendation. So.
Thank you.
Other questions? Here, oh, one more question and we'll end.
Okay. Okay, no, go ahead. Still time.
There's still time? Okay.
I'll make it a long-winded question then. So oral fluid seems to be the way to do the detection of recent use.
Yes,
and that's because pop breathalyzer is probably not coming for many years. One thing that's kind of been on our radar with technology companies is studying the eye and eye recognition and having baseline tests. So have you seen much research on that?
On
studying the eye, like retina movement. Again, we're just starting to learn about these sorts of things, and I know of a handful of companies, but again, I'm a skeptic for that. But
no, we don't know much about it. Okay. It's just a part of the standard field sobriety test. It's a several cues, right? So we usually what they say, the investigators, 2 cues are enough for the person to be suspected of being impaired if they fail 2 cues. And together with saliva test, screening test, if it fails, it goes to the evidentiary analysis, secondary sample. But again, it depends only if the police officer see the person as being impaired. Really, it's a blurred speech or red eyes or whatever. You see the person is intoxicated by the drug. and even the screening test shows 0, they should do a evidentiary test because the person is impaired.
Okay, thank you, and thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
I have a small token of our appreciation for you.
Thank you.
Please, and thank you, and thank you for coming, guys.